Hello, and welcome to Learn, Make, Learn, where we share qualitative and quantitative perspectives on products to help you make better. This is episode 1, and our topic is us. And speaking of us, my name is Ernest Kim, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Joachim Groger. Hey, Joachim, how's it going?
I'm good. I'm great. I'm excited. Excited to be here. Excited to be talking with you.
Oh, same. Really excited to be doing this. Now, as I mentioned, for our inaugural episode, we're going to talk about us, primarily so that we can talk about ourselves as little as possible in future episodes. Our intent here isn't to beat our own drums, but really just to share our backgrounds as relates to making products so that you have some context for the perspectives we share. And I want to emphasize that we want to hear from you too. So please send any questions and feedback that springs to mind while listening to this episode to learnmakelearn@gmail.com. Okay, so how about we start with you, Joachim? Can you tell us about your background creating products and services?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the beginning where products and services did not enter into the conversation at all. So it was all academic work. As a faculty member at a university, an academic economist, I did research, I did my teaching, I supervised PhDs, and I was working in an area that I like to call empirical game theory. And it's a very catchy phrase, talking about trying to encapsulate the complexity of what you're doing in a few words is tricky. So that one I felt captured a lot of it. So it's data driven. We're thinking about strategic interactions and all putting that inside of a quantitative framework. The main things I was doing, as I said, were research and teaching. And I was mulling this over as we were getting ready for this whole thing. And I was going to say initially that, knowledge production was the product I was involved in, right? I was thinking about questions, coming up with solutions to those questions and rinse and repeat and hope other people liked what I was coming up with. But the really interesting thing about academia is it's kind of a cheat. You get to pick the problems that you work on. So you're not confronted with reality, and reality is saying to you, hey, I need you to think about this right now. You kind of go in and go, oh, this sounds kind of interesting. And I probably have a way of tackling this problem and I have some tools, and then you go. So I don't think knowledge production falls into the bucket of product creation and service creation, because those are fundamentally problem solving, real problem solving. Like you can't pick the problem and you don't necessarily know what the solution is. So in academia, I think the closest thing that you come to being a product person is when you're in the classroom and you're teaching. Probably the one thing that academics think of the least, especially in research-driven institutions, right? So teaching is one of those moments of pure inception. It's very rare. Someone walks into this room and we assume they're ready to absorb information, but most of the time they're really not. You have to get in their heads and you have to motivate why it makes sense for them to be up at 8:30 a.m. sitting in a really poorly neon-lit lecture hall. Right? Even the surroundings are not designed to be conducive to learning and exploration and thinking. They're just office blocks. The worst of open office planning from the 80s is in the lecture hall, right? So I spent a lot of time trying to come up with these ways to incept and to get an emotional connection happening between the material, the speaker being me, the students, and creating this community of people that want to absorb information, And then what happens in that feedback is, of course, the students are going to come back to you and say, this doesn't work for me. How are we going to make progress in understanding these things? And so there's another problem. It's not the problem I want to work on necessarily. It's the one that's been handed to me. This is a student who thinks very differently than me, or a group of students that think different than me. So how do I form and reshape what's kind of fixed, which is the knowledge I need to impart? But how do I change the message, the medium, so that they can get it and rotate things so that they can see it from different angles? So that was, as I was about to fall asleep last night, how I was thinking about really the product problem, right? It's problem solving problems that are really not yours to pick. They're things that have to be solved. And so teaching is one of those that I think hits the hardest on that. Probably also why it's the most ignored, because it's really tricky. It doesn't get a lot of reward in the profession, right? Our success is determined by our research output. So all of that. That was a long little excursion into that, but I felt that that was the first moment of confronting the difficulty of product and innovation in that space. And so actually with that in mind, I was already kind of in that mode of enjoying being challenged in specific forms that I had not picked. And so industry was the next thing that I entered into. And so I entered into the tech industry very much as a data scientist, measurement guy. And in a way, coming in after all of the innovation has happened, all the product questions have been answered, and someone just needs to know, can I say this to my boss? We're making more money, or this is making people happier in these abstract ways. And so that was great training. It forced me to connect with a product view of how is it going to filter through the system? How are the user experiences going to be shaped by this product? And then how do you extract signal in the data that is usually not been designed to capture a human experience of this new product? So that was a really great, challenging problem, but it was very clear that, you're coming in after the fact. Most of the work has been done. Most of the tough decisions have been made. And now people just want to know, okay, it wasn't a total disaster, right? So then the opportunity came to move out of a classical tech environment and move into the innovation group at Nike, which is where we met. And that was I didn't know that was going to be the next step. It was a really interesting thing having a recruiter reach out and explain to me what it was that they were recruiting for. Initially, it was just data science. I thought, okay, here's another one of these enterprise data science questions, and sure, we can do that again. And then the recruiter started saying, do you know about shoes and sneakers? I'm like, yeah, of course. And Tinker Hatfield? And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Now we're getting a little bit deeper into sneaker culture here and design. And I thought, okay, yeah, I know Tinker Hatfield. Yes. And he said, well, this is the group that he works in, and I was hooked, and I was, okay, this is the next step. So that was my first exposure to actually connecting with the data, the digital product, how model ideas can be turned into product, and then how they interact with physical product, and I think it was very inspiring to even sit in these meetings. We were working on these cross-functional projects, Nike's super matrixed, and you're in the room, Ernest, explaining, hey, this is the newest challenge, and it's a physical product, and it's something to do with the shape of this, and people are responding that way. And I'm, oh my goodness, I'm going to see this in the data, and how do we put that back in so that the product can evolve and use that information? Absolutely fascinating space to be in. So that was really great. And then I think that's also where I realized that fundamentally I like being in the space of problem solvers. And that's the thing, right? Artists, sculptors, designers, they are natural problem solvers, and they usually have to solve problems that are just presented to them. Like, I want to achieve this thing, but it turns out I need to know about how a Wi-Fi signal bounces through concrete so I could get this thing to work, even though it might be an art installation, but now they have to think and solve this problem. The next steps were driven more about, okay, let's get some more tools. Let's go back into a traditional tech thing. And I worked at a social media company. I came in there with a very different perspective than the first time when I left academia. I was coming in with a more user experience focused approach. And so a lot of my work at this company was essentially representing the user and the experience that they went through in the data, very direct. And it was very empowering because now I could talk to a product person about pretty lofty data-driven work. I'm going to quantify a user journey here. I'm going to show you what a user journey looks like. And here's what it looks like in the data. And we have the data to be able to do this. And it's going to give us all kinds of cool signals that will be useful for business, but also for the users so that we can actually understand how are they feeling about this experience, So that's kind of where I went. And then the next step was to go into metaverse development, obviously. What else would I be doing next? So I worked at a video game company that was pushing into metaverse development, and they wanted to design a creator economy around that. That sounded really great. It was going to sit inside of product now. So now instead of sitting inside of a data science group or anything like that, I'm sitting inside of product, and I'm going to talk to product people all day long. That was very, very powerful for me, being able to shape things actually from the ground up. Now finally moving up the funnel, shape the product, talk to other people who have a different perspective coming from a design user experience perspective, and mine coming from an economics platform design perspective now and platform architecting perspective, and then bringing those together to turn something out and create something new. And then at the same time, close the loop, be able to measure all the stuff at the end of the day. So I'm in a happy spot now that I think I've figured out who I am. And it's been quite a journey as I say it all in one go to you, Ernest. But yeah, that kind of brings us to where we are today.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. One thing I should mention too is that the views expressed here are ours alone and don't represent those of our employers, past, present, or future, just to make that clear. But like you mentioned, Joachim, we work together at Nike. So that's something I've been doing for very nearly 15 years now. I started out as what is called at Nike a product line manager, or PLM. More broadly is called product marketing. And much as you mentioned you did when you were at that social media company, the primary responsibility of that role is really to be a representative for the consumer, to help the broader product team understand what the needs of the consumer are and what their journey is, just like you were talking about. In my case, more from a qualitative perspective. When I got started, we didn't really have a great data inputs. It was very much, or at least not great quantitative data inputs. So it's very much qualitative. But then, like you mentioned, I moved into some other roles that were more focused on innovation. And then right now, I'm in a consumer research role. So really focused on understanding the consumer and what they're looking for, what the journey is, et cetera. Prior to that, kind of maybe jumping back to the beginning, on my end, I came more from the visual side of things. I started out in web design. Actually, and this is dating myself, but when I was at university, I was studying multimedia design, which at the time meant CD-ROM interfaces. But while I was in school at NYU, the NCSA Mosaic browser was introduced, and I was just blown away by that. And so I very quickly got into web design, and I was very lucky, being in the right place at the right time. Lots of little agencies popped up. So that was kind of my first career, was doing web design. I had the opportunity to go and move out to Chicago to help start up the Chicago office of a company called Organic, which at the time was one of the bigger web marketing agencies. And I was the creative director for the Chicago office. And the first person I interviewed, the first person I tried to hire to join my team was a guy named Jason Fried. He had the wisdom to not take my offer, but we stayed in touch. And after about a year, we actually got together and started our own company called 37 Signals, which still exists today in a different form. It's called Basecamp. In the beginning, we were basically a boutique web design company, but what made us distinct is that we were really focused on websites as products. We didn't call it that at the time, but looking back now, I kind of see that was what we were doing. We wanted to work with clients who needed to be online and wanted to treat their online presence as a key part of their business. At the time, Flash-based splash pages were really all the rage, and we just hated the idea of, putting this thing in front of your consumers and blocking them from getting to your actual site experience. So, that I think set us apart and enabled us to kind of weather the storm that was the first .com bust that we lived through. But after 37 Signals, I moved out to Oregon. And I guess one thing I did while at 37 Signals was I always had this thing for sneakers, and particularly basketball sneakers. And so I started up this site called Kicksology.net, where I reviewed basketball shoes. It was honestly just an excuse to be able to buy more shoes. But by, really no intention of mine, it became pretty popular and helped me get connected with folks in the footwear industry, including at Nike. And so that's what led to me joining Nike. I actually have had 2 stints at Nike. So I had that first stint where I was a product line manager. And then after about 3 years at Nike, I got the itch to come back into digital because social media happened while I was at Nike that first time. And I just really was fascinated by that and wanted to get back into that world. So I went over to Wyden and Kennedy, which actually does quite a bit of marketing and advertising work for Nike, but I worked on the Coke and Diet Coke accounts, and that was just an amazing experience. I spent about 1.5 years there, and I just will always cherish that time. That was an incredible experience. And then, I would have stayed, but then I had this opportunity to go work overseas. and lead digital strategy at a small agency based out in Singapore. And that's something I'd always wanted to do, was live and work overseas.
Yeah.
So I did that. And again, that was an amazing experience, and also would have stayed there longer. But then after about a year and a half, a former colleague at Nike got in touch about a role in innovation back at Nike. So that's what brought me back. And I've been back at Nike ever since then. But really, kind of like you were saying, Joachim, the thread that's tied that together for me has been this interest in the understanding the why behind consumer behaviors. It's funny because before I joined Nike in this PLM role, I had no idea that that sort of a role existed. But looking back, I can see that that's something that I've always been interested in. Even when I was doing web design, I knew even then that I wasn't a great designer. I just was doing it because I wanted to make these things. But fundamentally, what I was always most interested in was that why, and delivering on that why. So that's kind of been the thread that's connected all these things that I've done over the years.
I'm so curious now, when you mentioned CD-ROM design, does that, maybe I'm grasping at straws now, but that is a very restrictive medium, very limited ability to get at what the consumer is experiencing in the moment. It's kind of a one and done. I make it, I hope I've figured it out, and it goes out there, and then people consume it. Very different from the closed loop feedback system we're in, where we're, at a microsecond, we're tracking the user and we're saying, okay, they dwelled on this thing for 2 seconds longer than another time. Does that thinking still shape things that you're doing right now, where you say, because you mentioned that you're also in a space that doesn't have all the signals ready, and you're now in this very unknowable domain where you're just trying your best to not guess, but educated guess, use proxy, figure out what else is going on in the ether. Is that something that you think you can bring back to that CD-ROM design, or is that just something that was there and that set you up for where you are now?
That's a great question. And I really do think it helped set me up for physical product creation, because it is that what you described, really having to front load as much as you can in terms of your knowledge base, because as you mentioned, you're not getting that closed loop data back. And, that was the case with CD-ROMs, and that's very much the case with physical products, at least the sorts of physical products that I had experience creating. You do get some data back, but it's much, much slower, much, farther off in the creation process. So I think it did help me to start to build that muscle of understanding that you really have to dig into it at the front end, and knowing that you're not going to have this crutch of being able to iterate, after the product's been launched, because, once because CD is a physical product, right? You have to print the bits onto a CD. And in the case of, say, footwear, that's a physical product. You can't, do an over-the-air update for that. So yeah, I do think that helped guide me. Having done both, there's definitely pros and cons to both. I think it's easy when you're in physical product to look at digital and think, oh, that's just such a luxury to be able to push out a follow-up update. But there are challenges with that as well. I think there's a benefit to the discipline of knowing that you're going to have to make a product and push it out there, knowing that you're not going to be able to update that incarnation of the product. And so I think it's beneficial to have had a foot in both of those worlds. But that's a great question.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of, in my domain, a big thing that economists got very excited about when these digital platforms were emerging was exactly this idea that they could run experiments. I think that in digital now, this is a strong statement, but why not? We're doing this to make strong statements. I think in the digital domain and in digital platforms, experiments have become a shortcut, a way of quickly iterating and not having to take a clear stand on what you think the product should be before you go for launch. And everyone's gotten a little bit lazy, and they hope that they can always do it live. So launch some version of something, people don't like it, update, experiment, rinse and repeat. You run out of the discipline that comes from taking a stand, right, as a product. This is the product. This is where the lace is going to go. And you're really telling the consumer, look, this is a representation of our thought process in the physical product, and we stand by it. We've done our best. Maybe not to everyone's taste, but we've got skin in the game here right now, And I find that a lot of digital domains, skin in the game with experimentation and iterative procedures has kind of been removed. People don't want to make those strong statements and say, we strongly believe that, it should look like this and it should feel like this. And so that's where I kind of also wonder how much of the internet digital stuff has become all very beige. Everything kind of feels the same. The physical space is still a place where you have to just say, this is what it's going to be like, and it's going to be this. And we're going to talk soon about things like spatial computing and headsets. I mean, these are big physical statements about where you think the future is going to be. And tech, I believe, really was a lot more of that in the past, and Apple did that a lot. So yeah, that got me thinking a little bit more when you said that front end work being so vital in physical stuff. And then I make it more grand by saying, you're taking a stand, right? Saying, I really have tried to represent you as best as I can, consumer, but I'm also bringing my quote unquote ideology into this game, right? You're bringing in what you think it matters, and yeah, taking a stand.
I think that's such a great point that I definitely agree that I think a lot of digital companies have sort of abdicated that role of editor and instead have just pushed it all out into, we'll just test it and whatever wins in the test we'll go with. But what happens there, which, as you've been touching on, is you end up with everyone offering the same solution because everyone's doing that same testing. Yeah. And so you have this, sea of bland experiences. And I think what you see out in the marketplace today in particular is people gravitating to these more opinionated, like you're saying, type solutions. When you look at physical products, you mentioned Apple, but also if you look at, say, automotive, Hyundai and Kia, doing so well recently with vehicles that are very opinionated in terms of their aesthetic. And so I think there is this real appetite for brands and experiences that express that sort of personality, that humanity, the sense that there's some human on the other end of this, that had a point of view and is offering that up. I think you're absolutely right about that.
I like that you mentioned the Kia and Hyundai. I think that is in the realm of, especially, I think you're thinking about EV vehicles as well, that they've been very, very forward and in some ways looking back as well, being proud to look at the Hyundai heritage and bringing a hatchback onto market and saying, this is referencing something we did when you guys didn't care about our products and thought they were terrible, but that's our heritage. And we bring it to the future and we show you, this is who we are. This is where we came from. And this is what's happening right now. And it resonates. People like that. It's not another typical SUV. It sticks out and it's idiosyncratic. It represents their culture coming into those vehicles again. So, and I think that's, as you said, that's a very powerful thing in a sea of bland. Yeah.
I'm actually hoping that we might be able to do an episode focused on Hyundai in the future, particularly their Santa Cruz pickup truck. I think there's a really interesting case study there, especially based on the introduction video that they used when they launched the concept before it was actually approved for production. It's an incredible example of product marketing done live. The sort of thing that's usually kept behind closed doors, they actually offered up to the public. So I thought that was a really interesting case study.
I'd love to talk about that, yeah.
But, okay, so you've now heard a lot about us. There's maybe one question I'd like to ask you, Joachim, if you don't mind. It's, what do you hope to achieve with this show, Learn, Make, Learn?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a tough one because it touches on everything that we've talked about. I think this is a place where we can start doing exactly that process that you're engaged in every day, Ernest, which is, how do we get signal on the world in a very, very complicated place with lots of noise? And how do we use our very different angles to come to a more fundamental understanding of the real state of the world? So I'm really trying to grasp at what is the fundamental why, the kind of the essence of the question. What are we actually doing with it? Are we actually tackling a real need, a real problem? And if we do stumble on someone that's done that, how did they get to that point? What is the context that allows them as a group to come together and do this? And again, I would love to have more voices in this conversation, as you mentioned at the front end. So I'm hoping that we will be able to bring in more people and more perspectives from our networks and beyond, who'll be able to offer up a very different angle of attack on how they think about these things. So for me, the emphasis is definitely on learn to then eventually help the make piece for myself. And as the name of the podcast says, we're saying learn twice, because it is very much, I think that's the ratio that you have to be in, right? That 2-to-1 kind of mix is important. And yeah, so I'd like to embody that thinking in this podcast for us, and show that it's possible to have people come together, different perspectives, and we're just going to learn, and then we're going to learn some more at the end of it. Yeah.
That's great.
What about you, Ernest?
That's very similar to my hope as well. I think one of the reasons we hit it off so well when we met at Nike was that we are both so interested in this. And at least from my end, I've found that I've not encountered that many other people who are really interested in this.
Yeah.
So to be able to find that community and bring other people together into a community to, learn from each other, bounce ideas off of each other. I really hope that over time we're going to be able to do that. And then this is, probably going to sound pretty grandiose, but I also hope that through that we can help to improve the state of products in the world. I think most would agree that there are just a lot of really mediocre products out there. Like we were saying, lots of Me Too products. And so hopefully by creating this community, sharing this knowledge, we'll be able to actually make some kind of an impact on the quality of the state of products out in the world. Well, I hope this background is helpful for our listeners. I wanted to wrap up with something that we plan to keep up with as a recurring segment, which is a product or service that we'd like to highlight for good or for ill, something that has us excited. So, Joachim, how about you get started? Is there anything that has you excited right now?
Yeah, this one's a funky one. I stumbled on this on Mastodon a couple of weeks ago, and it's a game experience. It's deeply immersive, but when I describe it, you'll be wondering why it's so immersive. It's called Telehack, and it's hosted at telehack.com. And it's a simulation of a computer terminal that's connecting to another remote computer. So it's the aesthetic is black screen, green text, like you would be back in the days on MS-DOS. And there are a set of commands that are given to you that you can use, and you just start exploring. There's no points or anything like that. It is a pure exploration, and it's all happening through a text-based interface. So it's not running a very specific language or something like that. It's trying to reference languages and feel like those things. But people have been stumbling on archive BBS posts that they themselves wrote. So they were able to follow a rabbit hole all the way down to some hidden archive of, old content from the early days of the internet. And of course, you can play games on it and all those things. But it has this really unique interface. It runs in your browser. You don't touch the mouse. It's text interaction. It feels immersive. You really feel like you're in a William Gibson kind of world. You've stumbled on this hidden nook of the internet. And the only way you can interact with it is in this very old-fashioned way. And so it's very compelling, and I've just been doing little 5-minute bits and figuring out what's going on. I mean, there's stuff where you just can generate a random hash or something like that. And, well, that's cool. I don't know why I would ever need that, but there's something about that immersion into, you really start believing this machine that you're logged into is a real machine that's doing stuff, doing things in the background, and it has a role outside of it. And then you start asking questions. Who set this machine up? What is it doing when I'm not here? Because I'm not actually the user of this machine. I'm a hacker. I'm not meant to be on the system. So it's one that I really, really, really enjoyed. I recommend it to everyone. It can be a time sink, I think. I've seen people go down wormholes, but it's definitely interesting and free to experience because someone just made it a passion project.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah,
what
it's
is it
very
called
fun.
again?
Telehack. And so we'll put that in the notes so that everyone can check that out. But yeah, it's well worth checking out. And I don't know who made it. I don't know anything about it. I just know this website exists, and I'm enjoying the mystery of that. I am enjoying the fact that there is a way to stumble in a world that is not open to everyone right now. It's just a little nook. There are many users on it, obviously, but there's still the imagination that kind of runs wild in this very, very limited interface. So
That sounds super cool.
that's my submission for this week. How about you, Ernest? What's on your mind? What gets you excited?
I think mine might be a little funky as well. I actually spent a fair bit of time trying to think about what should I highlight. There's, a few different things I've been excited about, but I thought for this first episode, it might be good to highlight a book that is not new, but is new to me. It's called Lavinia, written by Ursula K. Le Guin, who's best known, I think, for science fiction, but this is actually, it's not, I guess, what I would call science fiction. It's a retelling of the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, but from the perspective of Lavinia, who in that tale is an important figure, particularly in the last 6 books of the Aeneid, but she has no characterization in Virgil's telling of the story. She has no lines. And so it's very interesting to see her story, her experience, the story of that epic poem told from her perspective. I'll read the description from the publisher, which is Harcourt. And this was actually published in 2008. So like I mentioned, it's not new, but I just encountered it and just finished it last week. So as they describe it in the Aeneid, Virgil's hero fights to claim the king's daughter, Lavinia, with whom he's destined to found an empire. Lavinia herself never speaks a word. Now, Ursula K. Le Guin gives Lavinia a voice in a novel that takes us to the half-wild world of ancient Italy, when Rome was a muddy village near 7 hills. Lavinia is a book of passion and war, generous and austerely beautiful, from a writer working at the height of her powers. I think that's a really good way to describe it. That was my experience of it. And I wanted to highlight this because I do think that, particularly on the tech side of things, a lot of people tend to poo-poo literature. There's a sense that, reading fiction is a waste of time, but I just think it's so incredibly important too, as we've talked about a bunch over the course of this conversation, to get at that why, to understand human behavior, human desires, the things that are at the core of who we are and why we do the things we do. And I think that literature is just such an incredible way to get in touch with that. And so I would really encourage people, especially people who are in the business of making, to really don't look over literature, the arts in general, but I'd say literature being a really big part of that. And I thought that Le Guin had this amazing quote that spoke to this. This was at the National Book Foundation Awards in 2014 when she was given the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. And so I'll just read a little bit of an excerpt from her speech where she kind of speaks to this. And it's amazing because this speech was in 2014, but I think you'll see it's incredibly timely still today. So she says, "Hard times are coming when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. But then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, very often in our art, the art of words." And I think there's so much truth to that, so much power in those ideas. And I think that comes across in all of her work, but it absolutely came across to me in this book, Lavinia. So that's why I wanted to recommend that one.
I'm so happy that you did that, Ernest. That is, she is one of my favorite writers as well. And that speech, I was going to interrupt at one point. Oh, have you heard this speech? And yes, you have, of course. And it's very powerful. It's such a powerful counterpoint to what we were just talking about, which is the kind of abdicating responsibility to imagine something differently and to take a stand. And she always took a stand with everything that she was doing. It's funny that you say that about the literature being kind of pushed to the side. I think that's very true. It's considered frivolous and pointless, but good literature lets you imagine that other domain, other world, other ways of doing and being. And it's a great counterpoint to, as Le Guin references capitalism there, Margaret Thatcher, Britain's prime minister for many years, famously essentially shut down imagining alternatives. In her speech, she said, there is no alternative to free markets and all of those things. And what a sad thing to say. I offer you freedom, but don't stop thinking about what else is possible now. This is it, which seems contradictory, right? So I appreciate there were writers like Le Guin who are able to just articulate exactly that this is what we're here for. We're here to imagine those alternatives and engage with them.
Right. And I think that's something we can do through products as well, creating products that encourage and inspire that sort of imagination. That can be something that we can try to do through products. And I'd love to see more people aspire to do that, to touch that fundamental humanity in a way that I think so many products just don't seem interested in doing these days.
Very true. Very true. And bold statement, but I agree.
Well, this is an awesome conversation. I'm really looking forward to our next one. Thank you so much for listening to episode 1 of the Learn, Make, Learn show. Now, as I mentioned, we want to hear from you, so please send questions and feedback to learnmakelearn@gmail.com and tell your friends about us. Now, in our next episode, like Joachim mentioned, we'll be discussing spatial computing. With the Ray-Ban Meta Smart Glasses trending on TikTok and Apple's Vision Pro right around the corner, it feels like a great opportunity to talk about this new class of devices through a product lens. Who are they for? Is the lightweight AR-led approach embodied by the Ray-Ban Meta Glasses the way to go? Or will Apple's emphasis on mixed reality with its huge hardware requirements and huge price tag ultimately forge the path to mainstream adoption? Or maybe it's none of the above. We'll grapple with these questions and more on the next Learn, Make, Learn.